There you go.
December 19th, 2004, David Schwartz and Pamela Schwartz will be interviewing Dr. Marvin Harold Schwartz about the Schwartz family history and Marvin's history. Thank you.
Okay. What would you like to know?
Why don't you start with the history of how your family, as far back as you know.
Well, okay. I'm afraid that I can only, with some authority, take you back 4 generations. The history of my family, your dad's side of the family, is, although they were from Austria, it's really the history of Poland. How they got there, I don't have specific information, although I do have general information. I know Pam would like to think that we're of Spanish ancestry. I think that's unlikely. The research I've done was that very few Spanish Jews after the expulsion went into Central Europe or even went into Germany. The information I have that counter to that is that your grandfather, my father, said that they were Sephardic Jews.
See?
He was not always noted for accuracy, not that he prefabricated, but I think he was not trained in scientific approach, and so he would sort of seize on something and misinterpret it. I was told by a rabbi that the Hasidic movement, which was sort of centered in Galicia, was enamored with mysticism, and the Sephardic prayer book was more mystical. So that may be where he got that impression. What we do know is that historically, sometime around the 14th and 15th century, Jews were being, we can presume that our distant ancestors came out of the Levant, the area that's now Palestine or Israel, and went into the diaspora, but we don't know details. A lot of Jews were living along the Rhineland part of Germany in the 14th and 15th century, and conditions were very bad for them there. There was persecution, there were crusades, and there were pogroms, and people really feared for their safety. At the same time, the King of Poland, which was a very big country at that time, it had been united with Lithuania and occupied a good bit of Eastern Europe, invited the Jews to come in, and he would protect them and give them special privileges. His reason for doing this was that he had a very feudalistic society with maybe 5% or less of the nobility owning all the land, and that's all there was. There was no industry. And he had a peasant population which was not trained, backward, and not educated. Whereby the Jews, many who he invited in, many of them, most of them were literate. They could read and write. Many of them had skills. They'd been apprenticed in trades. Their families had seen to it that they got some education, so he thought it would uplift the country. As you might imagine, this caused some consternation that here these newcomers became the new middle class, and the vast majority of people were poor peasant farmers. And these people were different. And I don't have the dates with me, but about, over the years, Poland was being whittled down by its powerful neighbors.
So rather than talking about world history, why don't we talk about your history?
All right. Okay, we'll come up to that. I think you should know that Poland was partitioned around 1775, a series of partitions, and the three powerful neighbors grabbed off parts of it, so that the Austrian part grabbed the southern part, which is Galicia. And that's where both your grandparents are from. There's also an area in Spain called Galicia. Both names come from the fact that it was a Gaelic background far enough back.
So did this happen during your lifetimes? Or
No. This happened in about 1776, about the time of the American Revolution. All right, and before that, the names were patrilineal. Like you would be David, the son of Marvin, or David ben Moshe. And the family names came about, I think it was 1787. The Kaiser of Austria, Joseph II, said by December 31st, all Jews had to take German names. This was because they were going to collect taxes and they couldn't spell these Hebrew names. They were also going to start a conscription for military service, and it was to be a counterweight against the Polish population, which was always on the brink of revolution.
And you don't know what your name was before Schwartz?
I think it was probably patrilineal. In other words,
you don't know what?
Each individual had his name and the name of his father.
Right, but the last name that was
I don't
not
think they had
Schwartz.
last names.
No, the previous name to Schwartz, do you know what it was?
It was probably the name of, say the person's name was David, the son of Joseph. In other words, and then the next guy.
Yes, I get that.
In other words, there were no family names, only among Jews. Only very prominent people or noblemen have family names. All right. Your great-great-grandfather, I think his name was the same as your grandfather, Joseph Samuel, or Yosel Shmuel. Because your grandfather once mentioned he was named after his grandfather. Now, I do know about your great-grandfather. I'm named after him. His name was Moshe Chaim, which is Moses. Chaim means life.
These are all Schwartz?
And his name was Schwartz. How they got the name Schwartz is open to question. Often the names were descriptive. Sometimes it was the name of occupation, what they did. Sometimes it was arbitrary. Some local officials gave Jews ridiculous names and made them pay a fine or a bribe if they wanted a good name, like Goldberg, which is a golden mountain. So that's why you find names like that. The name was Schwartz probably from the time when they were forced to take surnames, which is a little over 200 years ago. Your great-grandfather, Moshe, who I'm named after, they lived in a town. I had my dad write out the name, the spelling, called Krostinkov. It's K-R-O-S with a little line over it, C-I-E-N-K-O. And I've got a map where I found it.
And so that's the great-grandfather and your father's father's father.
Yeah, that's right. They lived in this relatively small town. I've talked to Polish people who know the town. They say it's in the mountains. This is the Carpathian Mountains at the southern border of Poland. At that time, it was part of Austria, having been seized in the late 1700s. There were three ethnic groups. There were the Jews, the ethnic Poles, and what my dad referred to as Russians, who really were Ukrainians or Ruthenians. And there was a certain amount of tension between these groups.
Do you know how they got there and what they did there?
How they get, no, I don't, just only the history that I know of how the Jewish people got there. I don't have specific information. My dad talked about a book that they had recorded all the predecessors, but of course that's...
Wait, you might have said this, but I missed it. So they were Polish?
They were, I asked my Aunt Molly this, they considered themselves Austrian Jews. I asked her, how did you regard yourself? Were you Poles? Were you Austrians? Were you Jews? We were Austrian Jews, meaning that they were loyal to their Kaiser. They were different, culturally different from the ethnic Poles that they lived among, although they were subject to some Polish culture. My parents spoke fluent Polish. Their first language, I think, was Yiddish. That's what they spoke among their family at home. A lot of the foods that my mother used to make were Polish, modified to keep with Jewish dietary laws.
Wait, so your parents spoke Yiddish to you all the time?
No, I think they grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home. They spoke Yiddish between themselves occasionally. They spoke Yiddish when they didn't want the children to understand. And my mother and Aunt Molly spoke Yiddish, but their everyday language was English. We lived in a provincial area where there weren't many foreign-born people, so basically their language was English when I was a child.
And did they have heavy accents, like they were clearly foreigners?
No, they did not have heavy accents. They had, because they'd been in the United States for quite a while, I'll come to that, by the time I came along. They did have slight accents that you could probably pick up. There were certain sounds that's difficult for people who weren't born here. Now, your great-grandfather, Moshe Chaim, he ran a sawmill, and they also had a lumber yard in conjunction with that. I don't know for sure if he owned it or he was just the superintendent, but that was his occupation. They were near the mountains, and I guess there was a certain amount of lumbering. In addition to that, they had a farm, which your great-grandmother ran with hired hands. I told you where it was from. My cousin Milton told me that his mother, who was Dad's older sister, her job was to take food to the farm workers, and she had to cross a bridge to do that, so she would take them their lunch. As far as the family, I don't know too much about your great-grandfather's family. I asked my dad once, were there any other Schwartzes? Because basically my immediate family were the only relatives named Schwartz. And he says, sure, there were. There were a lot of cousins, but they were all destroyed in the Holocaust. So there are no more relatives named Schwartz. My dad's mother, her name was Malka, which means queen in Hebrew, Malka, and her maiden name was Eagle, like the bird. And I'm not sure what the origin of that name is. I've asked a number of people and they can't identify it, because most Jews in Galicia had German names. She had either 2 or 3 brothers who were named Eagle, and they actually came to this country, and I've met one of their grandsons recently, just by accident. So there are some Eagles. They're kind of scattered through the South. There's a family in Selma, Alabama, and then there is a man who lives in our area who is my second cousin. In other words, his grandfather and my grandmother were brothers. So there were 2 or 3 Eagle brothers. I know that one was Moses, one was Sam, and I'm not sure if there was a third. There was also another sister named Feldman, and their descendants live in Newton, Mississippi. And one second cousin of mine is in Louisville. And Ruth and Rob have established contact with her.
Is it likely or possible that there's still people in Europe?
I think it's unlikely. I think the ones that were not out were destroyed. Now, my dad's family consisted of, there was an older sister who stayed in Europe, and she died in the Holocaust. There was another sister older, and that's Aunt Sadie. Her married name was Yudkovitz. She preceded my dad here, and was in New York, and you have cousins that are descendant from her. Now, Dad also talked about an older brother who died as a young man in this country. I don't know the source of or what he died from. Okay, your great-grandfather, his name was the same as mine. I told you that he ran a sawmill.
So is it likely that he was inherited that position? Was it?
Well, when they killed the family, the Nazis seized all the property, and my dad made some faint efforts to get reparations after the war because they had property. They had, in addition to the sawmill, they had a farm, and he and Aunt Sadie had a lawyer look into it, and they wrote some letters, but Poland was under communism after the war, and they wrote back and said it's property of the people.
Right,
so they never had met any success, and they really didn't pursue it.
But I mean, if your great-grandfather, Moshe Chaim, ran a sawmill,
Yeah.
was it likely that his father ran the sawmill as well?
It's possible. It's possible. People often went into the professions of their parents, and they also farmed. They had a farm.
So the great-grandfather was also killed in the Holocaust, or just the...
No, I'll come to that. He was not in the regular army, but in wartime he went into the military, and he was some sort of non-commissioned officer, like a sergeant.
And around what year was it?
We're talking about early 1900. Oh, my father, your grandfather, and your grandmother were born in 1892. Okay, so your great-grandfather was a reserve military, or at least in wartime he went into the military. I don't know if he was drafted, and he was actually a non-commissioned officer, something like a sergeant. He served in the Balkan War. There was a war in 1912, 1913 in the Balkans between Austria and Turkey and Serbia, and I think Serbia was maybe on their side, and Russia got into it, and that's when a lot of those Balkan countries got their freedom from Turkey. Then, as far as I know, he returned to his farm, but World War I broke out in 1914, and he was again in the army. He was taken prisoner on the Russian front. My father was already here. He came here in 1909.
He wasn't very old.
No, he was 17 years old.
And what brought him here?
Probably opportunity, and perhaps his mother didn't want him to go into the army.
So his family encouraged him to leave, most likely?
Pardon?
His family encouraged him to leave to the United
I think
States?
they did. They did. He already had a sister here. She was married.
And how did she get here?
And I'm not sure. She preceded him, and her last son, Milton, who you met, died. So I don't know why she came here. But the uncles, that is the brothers of your great-grandmother were already here. So they had come here, and it was during a period where a lot of people were immigrating to the United States. They maybe came here in the late 1800s.
Wait, go back to the great-grandfather in the seized or captured in the army.
Yes, he was captured on the Russian front. Austria was an ally of Germany, and they were fighting both the allies, England and France. No, I'm sorry. I think Austria mainly was fighting Russia on the Eastern Front. Germany was fighting on both fronts, the Russian and France. And the U.S. joined for the last 18 months. I had gotten the idea from my dad that grandfather had died in the prison camp, but Milton told me that that's not true. He actually came back. You need me to stop?
No.
Came back after the war, but he had some sort of chronic illness and was never able to work again and died soon after. So my father was already in this country. And
his only living sibling at the time was Sadie?
well, and he had a sister in Europe. Okay. Actually, my dad went back in 1936, and I remember this.
Back to Europe?
For a visit. And I had the impression that I remember that. I remember him going.
Why did he pick 1936 to go back?
Well, I don't know there was any particular reason. Well,
Is it the
it
World
was
War?
25 years since he left. He left in 1909. I suspect, I have found out subsequently from Doris that one of the purposes of his trip was to try to get his family out, and they wouldn't leave. His mother, his sister, and her husband, and 5 of her children were there, and they all perished in the Holocaust.
And they wouldn't leave or they couldn't leave?
They wouldn't leave. I don't think they couldn't leave.
What country were they in? Still the same?
Well, by that time, I should tell you that Galicia, after World War I, they reconstituted Poland, took parts that had been taken by Germany, Austria, and Russia, and made a Poland again. And it was Poland when Dad went back. Excuse me, that cat is in here.
If you don't want him in there, you can push him away if you...
Okay, perhaps I should go to your mother's family.
Oh, wait,
Oh, what?
not yet?
All right, what do you want?
Well, I don't think, you didn't say anything about what your dad did when he came to the States, where he went.
Well, you don't want to hear about the family history on the other side?
Well, we
Well,
will.
we can do that separately.
Pardon?
But we'll do that after. Let's finish.
All right, my dad, when he came to this country, he lived with his sister, Sadie, who was married. At that time, they had a dry cleaning establishment. And my dad,
Where is this?
in New York, in Brooklyn, part of New York.
Like, did they come in through Ellis Island?
My dad came through Ellis Island. I don't know about his sister, but I assume so. And I think she met her husband here because he was from Slovakia or Hungary at that time. He worked for them, and he was 17 when he came over here alone, and probably came with next to nothing. He lived with his sister's family, and
And
he delivered.
You don't know what brought it? What motivated him?
Well, I think what motivated most people were the opportunity. A lot of people were coming to America, and it was considered the Golden Medina, the Golden Land. And I think people could see World War I coming. So there was a lot of immigration of Jews from Russia because they were being persecuted. They were second-class citizens. There were pogroms, which were riots where people were murdered. I don't think that was going on too much in Austria. I think officially they had equal status. Oh, there is one story that perhaps I should tell about your grandfather. Your great-grandfather had been a non-commissioned officer. He had his uniform. There were there were rumors of a pogrom. I don't know if you know what that is, Okay, pogroms were, I think it's a Russian word for riots, where the mob would get sort of pent up, sometimes by their clergymen, and they would go and attack Jews and destroy their property and actually kill people. And your great-grandfather went as, I don't know if he went alone or as part of a delegation, to Vienna, had an audience with the Kaiser, and the Kaiser actually had a pretty relatively benevolent attitude toward Jews, and he stepped in and put a stop to it. But I've heard that story not only from your grandfather, but from Milton, who got it from. So I think there's some validity to that. Okay, your grandfather, when he came to this country, he lived with his sister. He was making deliveries. At that time, if you had laundry, the laundry would send somebody to pick up your clothing and would bring it back finished. His sister's family had a dry cleaning establishment, and he did deliveries.
This is in Brooklyn in about 1909.
Well, they're starting in 1909. Okay. He also had uncles in the South, and I'll come to that. There is a story that at one time he was sent to Poughkeepsie, New York, which is a small town that I'm familiar with, because they thought he had tuberculosis, and it was thought that you needed to get out of the and into mountain air. It turned out he didn't have tuberculosis. At some point, he went to Nashville, and I think it was because of the uncles who were in business there and offered him a job. I know he spent some time in.
Do you know how they got there?
How he got to Nashville?
No, they
How his uncles got to Nashville?
I don't know. I don't know how the first one went. It must have
Wasn't
been.
there a story about one of them having an affair with the
Oh,
mayor?
that's your mother. That's your
No.
grandmother's side.
Okay.
I'll come to that. And I know Dad at one time, your grandfather, ran a store for somebody in Dyersburg, Tennessee, which is a smaller town. Okay, do you want me to pick up your grandmother's story?
Sure.
Okay. She was from a city called, also in Galicia, called Stry. It was spelled S-T-R-J-Y, pronounced, I'm sorry, S-T-R-Y-J, pronounced Stry, and I can show you on the map later. It's a little larger city. Her father was, and that would be your great-grandfather, was Wolf Rothman, was his name, and he was a cabinet maker, which is sort of like a glorified carpenter, I guess, but they call him a cabinet maker. Her mother was named Rivka, which translates to Ruth, and her maiden name was Schechter. Now, your great-grandmother, Rivka, bore 9 children. 3 of them died in childhood, which I guess was par for the course at that time. I don't know the story of all of them, but my mother once mentioned that one younger sibling had diphtheria. So there was one, that would have been your great aunt, died of diphtheria. There were 6 children who grew up, 3 boys and 3 girls. The oldest was Jacob, or in English it would be Jacob, but the Yiddish was Jacob. Then there was Sarah, or Sura. That's what was my mother's oldest sister. And I think the next was Moshe, who they referred to as Morris, and then Leib or Lewis. So those were the 3 boys. And then your grandmother, whose name was Peril, It's spelled P-E-A-R-L, like Pearl. And she wanted her name in this country to be Pearl. However, her brother, Uncle Jakob, was here already, and he put down on the papers Pauline, so her name remained Pauline. And then the younger sister was Aunt Molly, who some of you may remember. We went to her 50th anniversary. So that was the family. They all survived because they were in this country by the time of the Holocaust.
Did you know what brought them here?
Again, they had relatives who were here. I'll go into that. That's an interesting story. That's one of the family skeletons in the closet. Uncle Jakob, who's my mother's oldest brother, was quite a gay blade. He was a handsome guy. He was a big guy, very aggressive. I know he had been in the Army too, because I've seen pictures of him in uniform. And the story is, and I think this is probably valid.
So by gay blade, you mean a swinger, not a homosexual?
He was, no, not that word is only your generation. It means he was a swinger, okay? He was quite a guy. And the story was that, and he was a socialist, incidentally, and that wasn't very popular in monarchist Austria. But the story is that he was having an affair with a prominent man, I think the mayor of the town's wife, and there were rumors that the guy was going to have him bumped off. So that may be what precipitated the first brother coming here. There were also some cousins who were in Nashville. There were 4 sisters, 2 of whom I knew, who were in Nashville before my mother. So that may have, I don't know who came first. So he was the first one to come. Then Morris, the second brother, came also, and then my mother came. Now, my mother being your grandmother, she told me that she initially came without intention to stay, that she had promised her mother that she'd come back within 3 years. At that time you could get a visa for 3 years. During that, she didn't really want to go back when she got here because one thing she said is she didn't want to have an arranged marriage. Mm-hmm. Her older sister had an arranged marriage. Mm-hmm. Anyway, she came in 1912, and during that period, her mother died, and so she felt during the period between her coming here and
3 years?
The time when she was to go back, her mother passed away of natural causes, so she was released from that obligation to return. She had promised her mother she would come back.
Now, when she came, did she go straight to Nashville, or did she?
No, I think she lived in New York probably with Uncle Jakob for a time, and then, for reasons that aren't clear, went to Nashville. I think they both had lived in New York for a time, and somehow my parents met. I have a copy of their ketubah, but I don't know what year they married. They belonged to the same synagogue, and very likely that's how they met.
Was it common that people from Galicia would go to Nashville?
I'm sorry?
Was it common that people from Galicia or from the region?
No, not particular.
So it's just...
Not particular. I think as far as the Jewish population of this country, there's no concentration of people from any one area. South Africa is the only one that I know of that has that. Okay, so they ended up in Nashville, they met there and they got married. Your mother's immediate family, the rest of the family came after the First World War. That was Aunt Sarah, Uncle Louis, and your great-grandfather, Wolf Rothman. They came after the First World War, So they were all here by the time of the Holocaust. There were a lot of cousins who remained in Europe, and I met one of them who had survived. I met him in Israel when I was there. So your grandparents got married sometime after 1912. Right now I can get that date for you.
Are there pictures of the wedding or anything?
I don't know of any. No, I don't know of any. Your grandfather was in the dry goods business. This is a small neighborhood department store. It's something that I don't know if they exist anymore, but they were all through places like Nashville, Omaha, St. Louis, and for reasons that I'm not sure of, it was pretty much a Jewish industry, in that most of the people in that business were Jewish. It was considered a respectable thing to do if you didn't have professional education, and it didn't require a lot of capital, and if you worked hard, you could make a living.
So you don't know how he got into that business?
I know that he worked for other people, and his uncles had been in that business, and the people in Selma in the same business, and Molly's husband was put into that business by your grandparents. So this was very common. They had to have a little capital to buy stock, and eventually they owned their own store, the building the store was in. So that's the environment that I grew up in. As I mentioned, one of my second cousins on my mother's side survived the Holocaust. When Poland was invaded, Hitler and Stalin had a pact to keep Stalin out of the war for the time being, so that when Hitler invaded Poland from the west, Hitler invaded it from the east, and they divided it up. And the city where your grandmother was from was in the Russian-occupied portion. That was in 1939. In 1941, the Germans invaded Russia, so that area was taken. But one second cousin apparently went with the Russian army. I couldn't converse with him much in Israel, and showed up in Israel after the war. He was the only survivor of dozens of people in his branch of the family. His grandfather was an older brother of Wolf Rothman, your great-grandfather. Okay, where are we? We're in Nashville.
So this is 1919 or so?
Well, even before the First World War, your grandparents were married, and I have that date somewhere.
Were they impacted by the First World War at all?
It's kind of interesting. The United States got into the war toward the end. It was actually about the last year and a half. And your grandfather by that time was married, had a child. Irving was born in 1918. And they took the single men first, then the married man, then the men with children. He actually had a draft call to report in so many days. Usually they gave him 60 or 90 days to wind up your affairs.
Do people get married or have kids to avoid?
I never heard that was a motivation. I don't think so. Because if it's like World War II, people were very patriotic. Very few people were trying to stay out of the war. There were isolated cases of draft dodgers. On the contrary, after Pearl Harbor, people were lined up around the block to join up. I don't know if that was the same patriotic feeling in World War I. So your grandfather actually had a call to the military, and the war ended. And so they sent out an announcement that if you're supposed to report, don't bother. Now that wasn't the case in World War II. They continued to draft people the draft went on up to my day.
So do you know, do they maintain contact with any of the rest of the family?
Oh yeah, they were in contact, definitely. by letters. And as I say, your grandfather went back in 1936 for an extended visit, like he was there for several weeks, went on by ship.
And were those people impacted by World War I, or you don't know?
Yes. My dad said, your grandfather said that his town, that they were on the Russian front of Austria, changed hands 9 times during the war. So the battle was going back and forth through that area. So they certainly were impacted. And I think during and right after the war, people suffered a lot with, deprivation. There wasn't much food. Usually in the wake of war, things are really bad for even people who aren't in the service. And of course his dad had this horrible experience. You can imagine what conditions in the Russian prison camp were during World War I. Uncle Jaime, who was Aunt Molly's husband, had a interesting experience in World War I. He actually had to report in, and the war was almost over, and I think everybody knew that. So they reported in, they hung around the courthouse for a while, and then they said, we'll go home and come back tomorrow, and that went on for a few days and the war ended. Okay, so we're up to the World War I ended. Your grandfather became a naturalized citizen, I think not until about 1920, and I have that somewhere. I had to get that information when I got my Air Force commission. It took a while. You had to be in this country for a while before you could even apply, and then you had to be here 5 years afterward. You took out what they call the first papers, and you had to learn a lot of stuff. You had to take a very rigorous test. So he actually went to school to learn about American government, American history, to make sure he's proficient in English. And if I'm not mistaken, your grandmother never had to go through that, because at that time, if your husband was a citizen, you were automatically a citizen. I don't think that's the law now, but at one time, if you married an American citizen, you automatically got citizenship. Your grandmother, that's my mother, Pauline Schwartz, bore 5 children. The first one died the first day of life. She said pneumonia. I think it's probably was what we would call childhood respiratory distress syndrome.
Is that the kid's name?
Well, that's what they call it now.
Oh, the kid.
The kid. I think they were going to call her Estelle Ann. But, as I say, according to mother, she was sickly, and again, this was a layman's term. They put her in hot and cold water. Maybe that's what they did in those days. Anyway, she lived one day. That was the first baby. Then Uncle Irving came next. He was born, I think, in 1918. And Ruth, 3.5 years later.
Which is a relatively long time.
Pardon?
Which isn't that a relatively long time for back then?
Family planning, I guess. Now, there was a daughter in between Ruth and myself, and she was Estelle Ann. She was Estelle Ann. I don't know if the first baby had a name. And she was what they call a blue baby, cyanotic heart disease. And of course, at that time, we're talking, close to 80 years ago, 78 or 80 years ago, there was no surgery for that sort of thing. My sister,
Was that common at that time?
well, it's still common.
I mean, was it common at that time to have 5 children and only have 3 make it?
I think so. I think infant mortality was pretty high.
So the Estelle Ann one, how long did she live?
I think about 2.5 years. Because I was born 9 years after Ruth. And I was last. I was born May 3rd, 1931.
Did your parents sleep in separate rooms?
No.
9 years?
Pam, there was family planning even before Planned Parenthood. Okay?
Planned Parenthood was around by then.
Do you, pardon?
Planned Parenthood was around by then.
Okay. I don't know if they went to Planned Parenthood, but I think all of their children were planned.
And
And
how,
they did
how
not
old
know
was
they
your
did not sleep.
how old was your mother when she had you?
Both my parents, well, my mother was 38
That's old.
and my dad was almost 39.
Isn't that old for back then?
Yeah, but I was the last. You're still in the childbearing period. They had their first child in 1918, and there's a 12.5-year spread between Irving and I. Do you want to know what some of their siblings, children, you want to know about them?
Sure.
Okay, Uncle Jakob, I don't know about children that they had that they lost. Uncle Jakob had, he married Rosie, and I don't know her last name. He had 3 children. One was Tootsie. Her real name was Jean, but she was nicknamed Tootsie, and that name stuck. Her father gave her that name. And she was the oldest of the cousins, and she was born, I think, about 1908. Then she had a sister, Sylvia. Both of them have died recently. They were living in Florida. And then they had a brother, Lester Rothman, who became a doctor, and he's still alive. He's probably close to 90. He lives in New York. He married Rosemarie Brancardo. He was the first in the family to marry someone who wasn't Jewish. She was an Italian-American opera singer and apparently quite well known. These people all had children that I know about, and I could tell you about that if you want. The family tree gets pretty involved. Sarah had 4 children, and I think that they were all born in Europe and came here as very small children. She married Oscar Lerick, and their children were Lester Lerick. There were 2 Lesters, so they were named after some uncle or something. Lester, and then there was Max, and then there was Ruth Lerick, who married Jerome Ritt and came to Nashville to get married, and there's a story with that. If you're interested, I'll tell you. And then there's Minna, who was the youngest. Morris had 3 children. He had Mark, Manny, who was Emmanuel, who we were in touch with until his death a few years ago, and then Ruby, who is Toby's mother, Toby Kahn. Now, let's see, next was Louis. He had 4 children. Louis Rothman was his name. He had Norman, also Ruth, another Ruth, and David. He had a son, David. Now, I've told you about Pauline's family. Aunt Molly she bore 4 children. The first was Murray, who I think you know.
And Molly is your mother's sister?
And Molly is the younger sister. And I may tell you a little story about Aunt Molly. Aunt Molly was living with her older brother, Jakob, in New York, and she came to Nashville for a visit. And your grandmother, who was not one to joke around, she was fairly serious, she really wanted Aunt Molly to stay. So somehow she padded her dress and told Aunt Molly she was pregnant and she needed her to stay and help her with the pregnancy and the baby. So that was the story of how Aunt Molly came to be in Nashville. And the story, I don't know how she met him. Uncle Jaime Cohen, his family lived on the same street as us. His father was an old Jewish tailor. When I knew him, he worked out of his home, but apparently he had a tailor shop. He was from Russia. Anyway, he met Aunt Molly, and the story of how he proposed, he told me this. Ruth, your Aunt Ruth, was a little girl then, and at that time a quarter was an awful lot of money. And Uncle Jaime told Ruth that he would give her a quarter if she would go and tell her aunt that he wanted to be her uncle. So that was his peculiar way of proposing. They were in the same business as my parents in another neighborhood in Nashville. They had, as I started to tell you, 4 children. There was Murray, who's 4.5 years older than I. And then there was Ruth Estelle. In the South, people often go by first and middle names. It used like Mary Ellen or something like that. So Ruth Estelle was almost the same age as me. I think she was a few weeks younger. And she died when she was 3 of pneumonia. Nowadays, children don't die of pneumonia. And I have some very vivid memories of her. And then a few years after her death, Aunt Molly had Sylvia, and then 2 years later, Celine. Our families were extremely close. Mother and Aunt Molly had a very close relationship, almost unique as I see. Sisters, I mean, they were inseparable, and the families were inseparable. We lived, until I was 10 years old, we lived in different neighborhoods, and but we were frequently together in the evenings. We do things together, or on Sunday. My parents worked incredibly long hours. I'll tell you about our living arrangement. Our store was on what at that time was called Cedar Street. It was sort of a major street like, let's say, El Camino, where we lived. And a lot of it was commercial. There were a few houses. We were on around the corner on McMillan, the first house in McMillan. So we were not back of the store, we were around the corner, but there was a door that adjoined the house to the store. And my dad used to open up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he was open until 9, if you can believe that. That was 5 days a week, and on Friday, he opened at 7 and was open till 10. On Saturday, he opened at 7 in the morning and stayed open till midnight. And sometimes in the week or two before Christmas, they were open till midnight every night.
Did Irving work in the store?
We all, well, not full time. It was a ma and pa operation. My dad had 2 stores at one time. That's before my time. And he had a store in what's called West Nashville, further out. And I think during World War I, he had 2 stores. And that was one of the reasons that he wasn't drafted early.
What happened during the Depression?
During the Depression, well, our store and where we lived was in a working class neighborhood in Tennessee. And I don't know if you can imagine what working class people are like in Tennessee, or were at that time, but that's where we lived.
So
And
what were they like?
they were not very worldly. and they were poor.
What did most people do?
Blue collar type work.
Factories?
There wasn't a lot of heavy industry. There was industry, and I know one next door neighbor he was next door. He's 2 doors up. Was a pilot of a ship on a boat on the Cumberland River, a riverboat. Now our next door neighbor, my dad owned some property. He owned on a corner, not only our store and our house, but the house next door to the store, which was a duplex, which was rented out to black people, and the house next to our house, which in my early days was rented to a Jewish family, Cohen was their name, that had a grocery store. They moved away. Most people, as I say, were blue collar, and I don't even know what they did, but they were poor. And my folks never had a lot of money, but we were considered by our neighbor to be rich by comparison, because my dad, we owned our own house. We had the only brick house on the street. Everything else was, wooden. My dad had his own car. Most people didn't have cars. He rode the bus. We had pretty good public transit.
What did your dad do in order to be able to buy his store and buy his property?
Well, they worked hard. They were in the retail business. It was hard work, and they made it by nickels and dimes, and they were pretty frugal. Now, my dad also had bought some real estate. That was any surplus money he bought real estate. That was his way of investing.
So he didn't invest in the stock market?
He may have had some stock. I know that he mentioned that he had some stock in the power company, which was bought up by the government when the TVA came in. I don't think they were destroyed by the Depression, but things were tough. Their customers were all poor, and it was custom. The reason they were open so long on the weekend was a lot of their customers. The neighborhood was becoming more and more black. There were no blacks on our street, in the middle, but around the corner on Cedar Street, it was all black. So we were on the edge of an area in transition when I was growing up.
Transition to a worse, or transition?
No, transition from the South was very segregated at that time, and blacks and white did not live together. But we were on the edge of the neighborhood, and we didn't go to school together. They were in separate schools. The movies were separate. Restaurants were separate. They had separate water fountains. All the things you've heard about in the civil rights movement. There was one of the movies downtown which had a separate entrance or in the alley for blacks, and we called them colored people, and they were in the second balcony. But they had their own institutions. There were a couple of Negro movie houses in their neighborhood, and there were bars and clubs that they frequented. So it was really a divided society.
Did you know many blacks? Do you have black friends?
We did, we didn't go to school with them, and I knew some of the kids around the corner, but they didn't intermingle with us. At some point I'd like to take a break.
Whatever you want.
Want to turn it off? Can you turn it off?
All right.
Okay, I'm going to try to pick up, I want to go back and pick up your grandfather's family. I did not tell you about them. There were 4 children, of course. I think I mentioned that. There was the sister of your grandfather, whose name I don't know, who perished in Europe. Then there was Aunt Sadie, who lived in New York. came to this country and lived in New York, and then a brother who died as a young man, and I don't know what he died of, and then your grandfather. I didn't mention this, but Uncle Morris, your grandmother's middle brother, died of tuberculosis. I don't know if that's of any interest. And there's a story of that his granddaughter told me at Toby's son's bar mitzvah, that he had a friend with TB and who had a tracheotomy. They didn't have suction machines, so he used to suck out the tracheotomy for his friend, and that's how he got tuberculosis. So that's kind of a tragic story.
What do you mean suck out the tracheotomy?
Just what I said.
Suck out his...
The secretions, they stopped, because they didn't have suction machine. Now that's the ultimate friendship. Anyway, your grandfather's family. Okay, so there were the 4 children. The sister in Europe, who I believe was the oldest, had 5 children. And I don't know any of their names, except that one of them was named after the same great-grandfather, my grandfather, that I was.
And they all died in the Holocaust, presumably?
Yeah, they died in the Holocaust. My dad, after the war, communicated with one of his Polish neighbors, and she told him that his sister, this is your grandfather's family, his sister and her oldest son were shot in the house, and the rest were carried off, and of course they never heard from him again. He did correspond several years after the war with neighbors too. After the war, he tried desperately to try to find anybody that might be alive among his family, because after a certain date there were no letters, and I don't remember. He could tell you immediately when the last letter had come.
Does anybody still have those letters?
I don't know. And this was a very hard time for him. He was always, people used to say, Mr. Joe, that's Southern for when you know someone too well to call him by his last name, Mr. Schwartz, not well enough to call him Joe, Mr. Joe. Mr. Joe never laughs anymore. So the war period was very hard, not knowing, and we had no idea of the Holocaust, the magnitude of it, but there were rumors that things were not good, and he had not heard from him.